Ms Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by his statement, quote, "I don't want to see any New Zealand child in poverty," end quote?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I stand by my full statement, which is, quote, I don't want to see any New Zealand child in poverty. And one thing I'm absolutely committed to is making sure they get a decent education so they can choose their own life. But I think the argument here has to be to move people out of welfare into work. Mr. Speaker, that was reinforced by the Child Poverty Report yesterday, which says, quote, "A parent obtaining full-time paid employment is the most important event to lift a child out of poverty."
Metiria Turei.
Why has the Prime Minister scorned the idea of a new child payment, which has been recommended by the Expert Advisory Group on Child Poverty, as a key way to eliminate child poverty in New Zealand?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, the comments were made because a universal payment does not target those in most need.
Metiria Turei.
Does the Prime Minister agree with the Household Incomes Report that shows that universal superannuation has contained poverty for older New Zealanders to just 7%, while child poverty is at a high of 21%? That's 1 in 5 New Zealand children.
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, it makes many assertions, and the member can pick off bits and pieces of it if she likes. But overall, what it says is that the best way to deal with child poverty in New Zealand is ensure that there are employment opportunities for people who are caregivers or parents.
Order. I want to hear Metiria Turei's question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with Professor Philippa Howden Chapman, a member of the Expert Advisory Group on Child Poverty, that in New Zealand we have compulsory superannuation for all older people regardless of their income, and so we should also have universal support for our youngest and most vulnerable children?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, she is correct. On behalf of the Prime Minister, she is correct in what she says about the superannuation system. But what I would say is that when it comes to protecting vulnerable New Zealanders, we have a welfare system that in fact does discriminate in favour or allocate larger amounts of money to those who are caregivers. But what we can be certain of is that if parents and caregivers have work, you will lessen the prospect of child poverty.
Jacinda Ardern.
To the Prime Minister, does he acknowledge that 2 out of 5 children living in poverty are in the homes of families who are in work?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes, and that's why we are placing a huge focus on growing the economy. Our opponents seem to think that people's income situation can be advantaged by stifling an economy, by saying no to everything that might grow an economy. And that is not going to lift anybody, let alone any child, out of a difficult circumstance.
Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister think that the Children's Commissioner is wrong to conclude that a universal child payment for children aged to 6 and then targeted until age 7 would in fact capture very few wealthy families, but ensure that those kids who are most in need get the help that they do need?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I don't agree with that statement, and I'm surprised that the member can come into this House regularly criticising the government for apparently putting in place a tax system that advantages the highest earners, and then make a case for the highest earners to receive a universal child benefit. That does not make sense. It will not lift a single child out of poverty. What will is supporting economic growth in this country, and it's a shame the member and her party don't wake up and realise that.
Supplementary.
Jacinda Ardern.
Supplementary to the Prime Minister. If, as he says, his government's focus has been on growing the economy for those in poverty, why has the latest income report shown those in poverty have stayed in poverty, those in the middle have gone backwards, and those on upper incomes have all improved their economic status?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, once again you go to the particular measure that might be used. And on 2 pages in the report, page 81 and page 82, there are conflicting informations about the difference between incomes in New Zealand. What it does show very clearly, though, is that between the years 2000 and 2005, the income disparity in New Zealand, inequity, was at its widest point. And, Mr Speaker, even though we've had this spike up due to very, very real circumstances in this country and internationally, we are nowhere near those huge gap levels of the early 2000s to mid-2000s.
Jacinda Ardern.
Supplementary to the Prime Minister, can he confirm that the figures he just quoted from were before Working for Families has had its impact in terms of reducing inequality in New Zealand?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister... What?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, there is no evidence to suggest that Working for Families has been taken away, because it hasn't. And therefore, any suggestion... Well, it's quite simple, Mr Speaker. The gap between those income groups were in the years 2000 to 2005. Mr Speaker, I don't think it's fair to say that the figures in here don't show an effect, when in fact our opponents won't accept that the figures in here do show an effect of the global financial crisis and the Christchurch earthquakes.
Order. Point of order, Jacinda Ardern.
Mr Speaker, I asked specifically about the impact that Working for Families has had in inequality and on the figures that the Prime Minister was, on behalf of the Prime Minister, was quoting. I haven't come away with a clear answer from the Prime Minister.
Order. Okay, the Honourable Gerry Brownlee to answer further. Order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, in the graph on page 81 that shows the greatest disparity...
Order. I apologise to the Minister. Just one moment. Now, look, the member asking the question raised a point of order. Her question hadn't been answered, and the Minister has realised he didn't answer that part of the question. He's now answering it, and I believe it's reasonably should be heard. And there's too much noise. The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on the 2 graphs that I'm talking to, on page 81 and 82, the greatest disparity is shown in the years 2000-2005 under a Labor government. But on the other graph, between those same years, the trend line is flat. So that would not support the argument being put forward by the member.
Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why did the Prime Minister tell reporters yesterday that, quote, the very targeted, end quote, Working for Families payments was a better option than a universal child payment, when that very targeted in-work tax credit system deliberately excludes the poorest children in this country, those whose parents can't work?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, there are 2 things that need to be pointed out there. The first is in work, and that is our focus. We want more people who are currently having to live on benefits to be in work. And the second point was can't find work. We want people to make themselves work ready and are prepared to assist them to get work ready. So, Mr Speaker, let's be very, very clear. If people are working, they need to be given an opportunity to get the benefit of their work. When it comes to people who are not working, it seems strange that you just don't put benefits up to destroy the prospect of work in the first place.
Metiria Turei.
Supplementary question. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since the Prime Minister has now rejected a universal child payment in favour of targeted assistance, will he support the Green Party's members' bill that replaces the in-work tax credit with a child payment targeted at the poorest children in New Zealand, those who need it the most? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, the figures here themselves speak for themselves. There are many people in work who need that assistance, so we are not going to take it away. Therefore, we will not support the Green Party bill.
Question number 7, Tim McIndoe.